Emily Carter had always dreamed of serving her country. Growing up in a small Ohio town, she had watched veterans march in parades, admired their medals gleaming in the sun, and felt an unshakable pull towards something greater than herself. Her father, a retired fighter, had taught her about discipline, hard work, and pride in one's service. Her mother had warned her about the world's harshness, about people who might take advantage of her kindness. Yet Emily remained undeterred. She wanted more than a desk job, more than the quiet predictability of home. She wanted to wear the uniform, to carry the responsibility of being trusted with the nation's defense. When she received her acceptance to Fort Benning, Georgia, she was overjoyed. It was a prestigious training ground, and she had heard the rumors, the good and the bad. The unit she was assigned to, however, had a reputation that made her stomach tighten. Soldiers whispered of hazing rituals that went too far, of instructors who looked the other way, of young recruits pushed past the edge of endurance. Emily told herself she would be ready, that she was strong enough both mentally and physically. She didn't anticipate just how wrong she would be. Her first morning at Fort Benning was like stepping onto another planet. The sky was a hazy blue, the air thick with humidity, carrying the smell of wet grass and earth. She stood among dozens of other recruits, all stiff in their pressed uniforms, their boots gleaming under the early sun. Their eyes darted nervously from one commanding figure to another, some hiding bruises already forming from previous days' training. The sergeant overseeing their intake barked orders that made Emily flinch. His voice was like a whip cracking in the still air. The first drill began without warning. Recruits were ordered to sprint across uneven terrain, lift heavy logs overhead, and perform push-ups under a scorching sun. Emily's muscles burned quickly, but she pushed through, driven by pride and determination. Around her, others stumbled, some collapsing, their faces twisted with pain. Emily noticed how the older trainees, the ones who had survived several weeks already, watched with a mix of amusement and disdain. One tall soldier with a cruel sneer, whom she learned was named Jackson, approached her. "You don't belong here, Carter," he hissed. "Better learn fast, or you'll get eaten alive." Emily ignored him, focusing on her footing, refusing to let fear control her. By mid-morning, the training grew even more grueling. They were ordered to carry sandbags over a long course, crawl through muddy ditches, and perform synchronized drills. Sweat stung her eyes. Her lungs screamed for air. Jackson and a few other senior trainees circled her, whispering taunts, waiting for a slip. Emily felt a rising anger that threatened to boil over. She reminded herself of her father's words, "Discipline first, strength second. Control your mind, and your body will follow." But as the sun climbed higher, her body wavered, fatigue threatening to pull her down. Then the sergeant blew his whistle sharply, signaling an inspection. Recruits lined up in perfect formation. Emily stood tall, masking the tremor in her legs. The older trainees smirked, knowing what would come next. Hazing. The sergeant walked down the line, eyes sharp, searching for the slightest imperfection. Emily's uniform was perfect. Her boots shined. Yet she could sense it in the air. Something was about to happen. She had witnessed recruits being singled out for minor mistakes, for nothing more than the thrill of dominance. The moment arrived. Jackson stepped forward, claiming Emily had failed to maintain proper stance during a push-up drill. His voice was loud, cutting through the murmurs of the other recruits. Emily's stomach tightened. "I did it correctly," she protested, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Jackson laughed cruelly, and before she could react, he shoved her toward the ground. Emily stumbled, but didn't fall. "She's weak," Jackson muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Her pride flared. She straightened, meeting his eyes. "I'm not weak," she said firmly. The murmurs grew louder. Some recruits tried to intervene, but fear pinned them in place. Then it happened. Jackson's foot slammed into Emily's head. Pain exploded across her skull like fire, and she crumpled to the ground, dazed. The world tilted around her. The hot Georgia sun blurred into spinning colors. Her ears rang, and dirt scraped her cheek. She tried to push herself up, but the room or the field seemed to tilt beneath her. A few recruits gasped. A few others averted their eyes, unwilling to challenge Jackson or the sergeant. Emily felt anger and humiliation surge, mixing with the searing pain. She could barely breathe, yet somewhere deep inside, a small flame of defiance ignited. Time slowed. Every second stretched like a rope, pulling her into a mix of fear and determination. She remembered her mother's warning, "Always know your worth, Emily, even when others try to take it from you." She clutched her head, groaning softly, trying to steady herself. Jackson laughed triumphantly. "She's done," he said. The sergeant walked past without comment, pretending not to notice. Emily's vision swam. Tears pricked her eyes. But she refused to stay down. She forced herself onto her elbows and to her knees, shaking, wobbling, but upright. Her jaw set. She would not let this break her. At that moment, the distant hum of engines cut through the field. 3 black SUVs approached the gates of Fort Benning, a presence so commanding it demanded attention, even over the chaos of the field. The air seemed to shift. Emily barely registered the sight at first. Her world was still spinning. But the other recruits looked toward the vehicles, whispering urgently. "Generals." "Inspection," someone muttered. Emily blinked, trying to comprehend. Generals? Here? Now? She had no idea. The timing seemed almost miraculous, surreal, a thin thread of hope stretching across the field. The senior trainees noticed too, their smirks faltering. Jackson froze mid-laugh, realizing someone far more powerful had arrived. The sergeant stiffened, his face pale, suddenly aware that the chaos unfolding before him would not go unnoticed. Emily, still on her knees, looked toward the approaching figures. Her head throbbed. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer strike. And yet, for the first time, she felt a strange mix of relief and empowerment. She had endured the worst moments of the day, and help, unexpected, unstoppable, was arriving. As the SUVs parked and the generals stepped out, their presence radiated authority. They walked toward the training field, assessing the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. Sweat and dirt coated every recruit, yet Emily stood, trembling but upright. She didn't know if the generals would notice her, but instinctively, she raised her head, determined to face them. The sergeant's voice faltered as he tried to call orders. The older trainees glanced at each other, panic flashing in their eyes. Emily realized, with a surreal clarity, that the day had changed forever. The generals approached the center of the field, and one of them knelt beside Emily, his face stern but concerned. "Private Carter, are you okay?" he asked. Her lips parted, voice barely audible. I think so, sir." The general's gaze swept the field, taking in every exhausted, injured recruit. One of the other generals barked sharply. "Medical team, now!" Paramedics rushed forward, lifting Emily carefully onto a stretcher. The field, once dominated by fear and cruelty, now fell under the weight of accountability. Emily's defiance had carried her through the worst of it, and now the system itself would intervene. For Emily, those minutes stretched endlessly. She felt pain, relief, fear, and an odd sense of vindication all at once. She had been kicked in the head, humiliated, and tested beyond her limits. Yet she had survived, and now, powerful figures were taking control of the chaos. Around her, soldiers whispered, some crying softly, others staring in stunned disbelief. The sergeant tried to speak, but one of the generals silenced him instantly. Authority had arrived, and nothing in that moment could challenge it. Emily's journey had begun in terror, but the first glimmer of hope had appeared. Emily Carter lay on the stretcher, the heat of the Georgia sun beating down on her bandaged head. Her vision swam with flashes of pain and confusion, but she was alive. Around her, the field was a scene of chaos, frozen in a single surreal moment. Soldiers who had once carried themselves with a mix of arrogance and fear now shuffled nervously, eyes wide, unsure where to look. The black SUVs gleamed under the sun, their polished surfaces reflecting the uniforms and the dust. 3 generals, figures of authority and power, stood in the center of the field, surveying everything with sharp, scrutinizing eyes. Time seemed to slow. Emily could hear the hum of her own heartbeat, mingled with the distant murmurs of other recruits. Whispers spread across the field like wildfire. Generals are here. This is serious. Is she okay? Each word, each gasp, carried weight. Even Jackson, the trainee who had kicked her moments ago, seemed frozen, a flicker of panic crossing his face. The sergeant, usually a figure of unshakable command, was pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had been in charge of enforcing brutality for months, and now, under the watchful eyes of the Pentagon, his authority was crumbling. Emily felt the stretcher shift slightly as medics adjusted her position. Her head throbbed with every movement, a jagged rhythm that mirrored the chaos surrounding her. Pain mixed with a strange, burgeoning sense of vindication. Minutes ago, she had been humiliated, kicked in the head, left for her fellow recruits' fear to dictate whether she would be helped. And now, the balance of power had shifted. Authority had arrived, tangible and unyielding, and the people responsible for her suffering were exposed under its glare. The senior general, a tall man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, stepped closer, his gaze sweeping across the assembled soldiers. His voice was calm, but carried an edge that silenced every whisper. "Private Carter, can you tell me exactly what happened?" Emily swallowed hard, dizziness making the words stick in her throat. She forced herself to speak clearly, every syllable measured. "Sir, I was carrying out my drills as instructed. One of the senior trainees, Jackson, kicked me in the head. The sergeant didn't intervene." Her voice shook, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of naming her aggressors under scrutiny. A ripple of tension ran through the group. Jackson's face turned crimson, and he looked down, avoiding every eye. The sergeant's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to speak, but another general cut him off sharply. "Do not speak. Not a word," he commanded. His tone carried the weight of a man who had dealt with insubordination countless times and who would not tolerate it now. Emily felt a faint flicker of awe. The same authority that had allowed years of abuse to flourish had arrived and was now wielding justice decisively. The medics carefully lifted Emily from the stretcher and guided her toward the medical vehicle waiting at the edge of the field. Her head was throbbing, every movement sending pain shooting across her skull, but she focused on keeping her breathing steady. One medic gently spoke. "You're going to be okay, Private. We'll make sure of it." She nodded weakly, clinging to the words, clinging to the knowledge that help had arrived in time. As Emily was moved, the generals continued their inspection. They walked methodically through the ranks, stopping at injured or trembling recruits, asking questions, observing. Soldiers who had once laughed at abuse now spoke quietly, names and incidents spilling out under the gentle but unyielding questioning. Fear had frozen their voices for months, but the presence of top-ranking officials broke the spell. Emily overheard fragments. "He made us run with rocks in our packs. We were forced to crawl through mud for hours. I saw her get kicked in the head." Each confession reinforced a pattern, a system that had allowed cruelty to thrive unchecked. The sergeant, pale and trembling, was called forward. His voice quivered as he attempted a justification. "Sir, this is training. It's how we prepare them. Discipline is necessary." But another general stepped forward, cutting him off with a gaze so cold it felt like ice. "Discipline does not mean cruelty. Authority does not mean terror. You have failed every standard of leadership expected of you." The sergeant opened his mouth again, but no words came. The field, once dominated by fear, had shifted irreversibly. Emily, meanwhile, sat in the back of the medical vehicle, the hum of the engine echoing in her skull. She could feel her pulse racing, not entirely from the injury, but from the surreal sense of witnessing history in motion. Around her, recruits began whispering to each other, some crying quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had endured days, weeks, even months of harassment, but now someone had finally stepped in. The general's arrival had turned the tide, and Emily realized her ordeal had become the catalyst for accountability. As the vehicle drove her toward the base hospital, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Pain throbbed with every bump on the road, but she also felt a seed of empowerment taking root. Her defiance, her refusal to be broken completely, had mattered. The authorities had noticed, had acted, and were now holding those responsible to account. Even in her weakened state, she felt a sense of pride. She had faced humiliation, physical assault, and intimidation, and she had survived. Inside the hospital, medical staff worked quickly, assessing her injuries. A nurse gently checked her pupils, tested her reflexes, and monitored her vitals. Emily winced at the touch, but kept her eyes steady. The nurse murmured, "You're going to be fine, but you're lucky." This was serious. "We'll keep you under observation for a while." Emily nodded, grateful. The reality of what had happened slowly began to sink in. Minutes ago, she had been the victim of deliberate violence. Now, she was the center of a response that could change lives. Outside the hospital, word of the general's intervention spread across the base like wildfire. Soldiers whispered to one another, their fear and confusion mixing with cautious relief. Those who had been silent for months now found courage in numbers. Names, incidents, and accounts were being passed along, each story a thread revealing the true scope of abuse that had gone unchecked. Emily overheard one recruit mutter, "She made them act. She forced them to see it." The thought struck her. Her presence, her defiance, had set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Back at the field, the generals held a brief, impromptu meeting with the remaining instructors. Commands were issued immediately. The unit was shut down, equipment removed, all personnel under review. The abruptness shocked everyone. For months, recruits had endured relentless drills, harassment, and intimidation, believing this was normal. Now, the top ranks had intervened decisively, turning fear into accountability. Emily felt a rush of vindication, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion. She had survived not only the assault, but the oppressive culture that allowed it, and she had done so in full view of those who held ultimate authority. In the hours that followed, Emily lay in a hospital bed, head throbbing, bruises forming, but her mind was active. She replayed the moments, the kick, the humiliation, the fear, and the sudden arrival of the generals. Each memory carried a sting, yet a thread of hope ran through it all. She had faced her darkest hour and emerged not broken, but noticed. The system, flawed as it was, had been forced to act. She realized the impact of her survival went beyond herself. It was the beginning of change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Fort Benning, Emily stared out the window. The world seemed different, charged with possibility. She thought of her fellow recruits, of those still at the field, of the lives that might now be spared abuse because someone had finally intervened. Pain throbbed in her head, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose. She had been kicked down, humiliated, and nearly broken, but she had survived. And in surviving, she had begun to rewrite the rules. In those quiet moments, Emily felt a surge of determination. The general's arrival was a start, but she knew the work was far from over. Reports would be filed, investigations launched, and changes implemented, but it would take voices, courage, and persistence to ensure lasting reform. She had one thing the abusers did not: truth and resilience. And with that, she understood something profound. Real power did not belong to those who inflicted fear, but to those who survived, spoke, and demanded accountability. The field at Fort Benning felt like a strange, suspended reality. The dust hung in the air, stirred by the gentle evening breeze. Yet the tension was palpable, as if every blade of grass and speck of dirt had absorbed the fear and defiance of the day. Soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, their uniforms clinging to their sweat-soaked bodies. Emily, bandaged and bruised, sat upright in the medical vehicle, her head throbbing, every pulse a sharp reminder of what had happened. Yet she could sense that something fundamental had shifted, something irreversible. 3 generals had arrived, their presence like a blade cutting through the oppressive air. They moved methodically, observing the chaos that had dominated the unit for months. Their sharp eyes noted every detail: a limp, a bruise, a nervous glance, the way some recruits avoided eye contact with their superiors. Emily watched as whispers spread like wildfire among the soldiers. Fear had ruled this unit for too long, and now that fear had transformed into awe, uncertainty, and a hint of hope. Jackson, the trainee who had struck her, stood frozen near the sergeant, his usual arrogance stripped away by the general's authoritative presence. He had thrived on intimidation, yet now he faced men whose word was law, and whose experience had not been earned through cruelty, but through service, discipline, and accountability. Emily noticed how even the sergeant, who had once wielded fear like a weapon, faltered under their gaze. His voice, which had bellowed commands, was now tight and uncertain, unable to find the words that would justify months of abuse. The general's methodical inspection began with the immediate attention to injuries. Paramedics moved quickly across the field, tending to bruised, exhausted, and terrified recruits. Emily, though in pain, listened to the murmured accounts as others began to recount months of abuse, once hidden under a veil of fear. One soldier whispered about being forced to carry sandbags weighing more than his body across uneven terrain for hours on end. Another recounted enduring hours of push-ups and sprints while being insulted, mocked, and occasionally struck. Every confession wove a tapestry of cruelty, highlighting the systemic failures that had gone unchecked. Emily's thoughts drifted to the first kick, the moment Jackson's boot collided with her skull. Pain had dominated that instinct, yet now, in the context of accountability, it felt almost surreal. The generals had stepped in at the perfect moment, and the consequences were immediate. One of the generals knelt beside her, his voice calm but commanding. "Private Carter, your report is being taken seriously. Can you walk with us?" Emily nodded slowly, mindful of the dizziness that threatened to unbalance her. She rose to her feet, every muscle aching, and followed, feeling the strange mix of humiliation and empowerment that only a life-altering event could bring. As they walked across the field, Emily heard the generals' voices directing attention to specific incidents. Identify all involved in this behavior. Document every instance. Those responsible will face consequences. The words were precise, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. Soldiers whispered to one another, some openly crying, others silently shaking. Emily realized that the unit's hierarchy had collapsed in moments, replaced by a system of accountability that could not be ignored. For months, power had been concentrated in the hands of abusers. Now, it rested in the hands of those willing to enforce justice. The sergeant attempted to intervene, trying to justify his actions. "Sir, this is standard discipline. It's training. They must be hardened." He stopped mid-sentence, silenced by the cutting gaze of a general. Discipline does not excuse abuse. Leadership does not excuse fear. You have failed, and your methods are unacceptable. The sergeant's face paled, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely aware of the consequences awaiting him. Emily felt a shiver of satisfaction, tempered by compassion. She had never wished harm upon anyone, but justice was now unavoidable, and the balance had shifted irrevocably. Emily's gaze swept over the assembled soldiers. Some were stunned into silence, their previous arrogance erased. Others whispered their disbelief, the weight of months of fear pressing on their shoulders. Names and incidents that had been hidden for weeks now flowed freely under the general's presence. Each soldier who spoke contributed to a growing mosaic of truth that demanded recognition. Emily realized she was witnessing history, a breaking point where the culture of abuse could no longer continue. Her own experience had become both catalyst and witness, a spark igniting overdue reform. The generals moved systematically, ensuring every detail was recorded. Emily overheard one ask, "Who is responsible for supervision?" Who ignored these warnings? Soldiers named names, identifying senior trainees and instructors who had perpetuated the culture of cruelty. Jackson's shoulders slumped. He avoided every gaze, realizing that no defense would absolve him of the actions now documented. The sergeant's attempts to speak were repeatedly cut off. Authority had shifted, and the mechanisms of accountability were exacting justice with surgical precision. Emily felt her pulse quicken not from fear, but from the knowledge that her ordeal had forced action. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the field, Emily was led to a small tent where the generals held a preliminary debrief. Her head still throbbed, but she could think clearly, listening as the generals outlined their next steps. "Medical evaluation for all recruits immediately," one said. "Suspension and investigation of instructors and senior trainees. Shutdown of the unit effective immediately. No exceptions." Emily's heart raced. Months of fear and humiliation had led to this decisive moment. She realized that her defiance, her refusal to submit entirely to the cruelty, had mattered more than she had imagined. While she rested briefly, other recruits were interviewed systematically. Emily overheard stories that made her stomach churn, forced hours of physical labor, verbal assaults, and even threats of physical violence. She felt a strange kinship with those around her, their suffering now validated and recognized. The generals were thorough, asking questions, cross-referencing accounts, and taking detailed notes. It was a level of accountability that none of the soldiers had imagined possible. Emily's own story, once isolated and almost invisible, now formed the centerpiece of a systemic reckoning. The day stretched into evening, the field bathed in a golden light that contrasted sharply with the dark memories of the hours prior. Emily felt exhausted, pain radiating from her head and body, yet her mind buzzed with clarity. She had endured physical and emotional trials that had seemed insurmountable, yet she was witnessing something extraordinary, the immediate dismantling of a culture built on fear. She understood, for the first time, that courage was not always about confrontation or physical strength, but about standing up in the face of injustice and refusing to be silenced. As the medical team evaluated her fully, Emily reflected on the moments that had led here. The kick, the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible and powerless, all of it had contributed to a larger narrative now in motion. She had been a single point of resistance in a system built to crush individuality, and that resistance had drawn attention from the highest levels of authority. The general's presence was not just a procedural intervention. It was a statement, a declaration that abuse and fear would no longer dictate the lives of young recruits. By the time Emily was fully assessed and stabilized, night had fallen over Fort Benning. The field was quiet, except for the distant murmur of soldiers processing the day's events. Trucks were dispatched to remove equipment, senior trainees were isolated for questioning, and the sergeant was escorted for debriefing under supervision. Emily felt a deep fatigue, yet a strange sense of empowerment. Her ordeal had been painful and humiliating, but it had also sparked a reckoning. She had survived, and in doing so, she had begun to change the lives of countless others. As she lay on the cot in the medical tent, Emily stared at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. Each memory carried both pain and triumph. She had been kicked down literally and figuratively, but she had stood again, even in the haze of injury. She realized that this was not just about her. It was about every soldier who had suffered in silence. Her defiance, her endurance, and her willingness to speak had catalyzed a process that could reform the unit entirely. In those quiet moments, Emily felt a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and profound clarity. The general's intervention had marked the beginning of accountability, but she understood that systemic change would require more than a single day or a single incident. Still, she allowed herself a small measure of pride. She had endured brutality, she had survived, and she had been noticed. In that recognition, there was the power to catalyze change, the power to break cycles of abuse, the power to transform fear into justice. And for the first time in months, Emily felt a spark of hope. She had been kicked in the head, humiliated, and tested beyond her limits, yet she had emerged with her spirit intact. The general's decisive presence had altered the trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone in the unit. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion take hold. Yet in the back of her mind, she understood that this was only the beginning of a journey, one that would challenge her, inspire others, and ultimately reshape a culture that had long been broken. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Fort Benning, the aftermath of the day's chaos continued to unfold. Emily Carter lay on the cot inside the medical tent, her body exhausted, every muscle aching, her head still pounding from the kick she had endured. Despite the pain, her mind remained sharp, racing over everything that had transpired. She had survived the humiliation, survived the assault, and now she was witnessing something she had only dreamed of, the army finally responding to months of unchecked cruelty. The general's presence had changed everything, but their work was only beginning. Outside the tent, trucks began hauling away the training equipment, sandbags, and logs that had been instruments of both discipline and abuse. Soldiers moved. In near silence, their usual chatter replaced by whispers and uneasy glances. No one dared make a move without explicit orders, and the sergeant once, a figure of unchallenged authority, walked stiffly behind the generals, fully aware that every word, every hesitation, and every misstep was being scrutinized. Emily could hear fragments of conversations as she lay resting, bits of confessions from recruits who finally felt safe enough to speak. We had to carry rocks in our packs for hours. They made us crawl through mud until we couldn't feel our hands. Each admission wove a thread in a tapestry of abuse that had been hidden for too long. One of the generals approached Emily's cot, his steps deliberate. His face, though stern, carried a hint of compassion that comforted her. "Private Carter," he said, voice calm yet commanding, "you are the reason we're here. Your report has been taken seriously, and every measure will be taken to ensure the responsible parties are held accountable. Are you able to speak to the others? Give your statement?" Emily hesitated. Her head throbbed, and the recent pain still made the world spin. Yet she knew that what she said now could influence the lives of countless soldiers. She nodded. I'll do it, sir," she whispered. The generals arranged a small area where Emily could speak safely. Recruits gathered around, some leaning against walls, others sitting on crates or the bare dirt floor. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, fear, and tentative hope. They had endured months of abuse, yet for the first time, they were witnessing accountability in action. Emily felt a tremor of nervous energy course through her body. Speaking in front of authority had always been intimidating, but she realized she had something powerful, the truth. And that truth was enough to demand attention. Emily began, her voice shaky but resolute, was kicked in the head today by a senior trainee during drills. The sergeant didn't intervene. I tried to continue the exercise, but I was hurt, humiliated, and ignored. This is not training. This is abuse. Her words carried weight, and she could see the reactions in the soldiers around her. Some nodded silently, relief visible on their faces, while others looked down, shame or fear written in their eyes. The generals took careful notes, asking clarifying questions, ensuring every detail was documented. As Emily spoke, she noticed Jackson standing off to the side, pale and tense. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief. For months, he had relied on intimidation to assert control over other recruits, but now the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The sergeant, too, remained silent, his face tight with anxiety. The generals made it clear that they would not tolerate excuses. Authority, when exercised through fear and cruelty, had consequences. Emily realized that in standing up and speaking the truth, she was no longer a victim, she was a catalyst. After Emily finished recounting her experience, one of the generals addressed the group. You all have endured conditions and behaviors that are unacceptable. Your courage in speaking out ensures that those responsible will face the consequences they deserve. No soldier should be subjected to the kind of abuse you've described. We are implementing immediate reforms, and the unit will be shut down effective today. A collective gasp echoed across the room. Relief, disbelief, and cautious optimism rippled through the ranks. For the first time, the soldiers could believe that change was possible. Medical personnel continued to examine the recruits. Bruises, sprains, and signs of exhaustion were catalogued, each injury a testament to the harsh conditions and physical abuse they had endured. Emily watched as friends and fellow recruits received care, her heart pounding with a mixture of empathy and determination. She understood that their suffering had been ignored for too long, and now, with the intervention of the generals, accountability was finally taking root. The system that had allowed cruelty to thrive was being dismantled, and every soldier's voice mattered. The sergeant was called forward for questioning. His hands trembled slightly as he attempted to justify the actions he had condoned. Sir, discipline is necessary. It prepares soldiers for real-world conditions. One of the generals cut him off with a single cold glance. This is not discipline. This is abuse. You have failed your responsibilities as a leader. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation. The weight of those words settled over the sergeant, and for the first time, he understood the gravity of his failure. Emily, despite her exhaustion and pain, felt a surge of resolve. She had survived not only the physical assault, but the oppressive culture that had enabled it. Standing there, surrounded by her fellow recruits and the generals, she realized that her defiance, her refusal to be broken completely, had forced a reckoning. For months, silence had been the tool of survival. Now, truth was the weapon. The general's decisive action had made her ordeal meaningful, turning her suffering into a catalyst for change. As the night deepened, Fort Benning transformed from a place of fear into a scene of accountability and reform. Trucks and personnel moved systematically, ensuring the unit's operations were temporarily suspended. Senior trainees and instructors were isolated for questioning, while the medical evaluation of recruits continued. Emily's head throbbed, but a quiet sense of pride replaced some of the pain. Months of fear, humiliation, and exhaustion had culminated in a turning point, a moment where the system itself could no longer ignore injustice. Throughout the night, Emily reflected on the moments that had brought her here. She thought about the kick, the humiliation, the fear that had once seemed inescapable. And she thought about the generals, whose presence had shifted the balance of power instantly. Without them, the abuse might have continued unchecked. But now, change was in motion. She understood that while this intervention was only the beginning, it had set a precedent. Accountability was no longer optional. Authority no longer belonged to those who inflicted fear. The truth had power, and it had been recognized. The recruits, slowly recovering from the emotional shock of the events, began to whisper among themselves. Some cried quietly, others stared in disbelief, and a few exchanged tentative smiles. Emily realized that her survival had given them courage, the courage to speak, to acknowledge their experiences, and to hope for change. She had been the center of this reckoning, and in doing so, she had empowered those around her. Every detail she recounted, every injury she had endured, became part of the larger narrative of justice. By the time the medical evaluation was complete, Emily had been briefed on the immediate reforms. Anonymous reporting systems would be implemented, leadership retraining mandated, and oversight tightened to prevent further abuse. The generals had made it clear that this unit would no longer function under the same conditions. For Emily, the weight of the day's events was almost overwhelming, yet she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Her courage, her survival, and her willingness to speak the truth had changed lives, not just her own, but the lives of every recruit present. As the hours passed, Emily found herself thinking of home. Ohio seemed impossibly far away, yet the memories of family, small-town life, and her dreams of serving her country gave her a grounding point. She had come here seeking purpose, and she had found it not only in service, but in moral courage. She had faced the worst aspects of a broken system, and emerged alive, heard, and validated. And in that moment, she understood that real change often began with a single act of defiance. By the time the night fully settled over Fort Benning, Emily was lying on her cot, exhausted, bruised, and battered, yet unbroken. The general's decisive presence had dismantled the unit's oppressive power structure, and the first steps toward reform were underway. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over her, yet inside, a spark of determination burned. She knew this was only the beginning of a longer journey, one that would involve ongoing challenges, courage, and resilience. But for the first time in months, Emily felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by a sense of hope, justice, and purpose. The next morning at Fort Benning felt strangely surreal. The once dreaded training field, where months of abuse and fear had been enforced, was eerily quiet. Soldiers moved slowly, their faces reflecting exhaustion, disbelief, and tentative hope. Trucks had hauled away the heaviest equipment, sandbags, logs, and makeshift obstacles, and the shadow of authority now felt less like oppression and more like oversight. Emily Carter, still recovering from the kick to her head, sat in the base hospital, head wrapped in bandages, her body sore and stiff, yet her mind sharper than it had been in weeks. She had survived both the attack and the oppressive environment that had allowed it. Her parents had arrived from Ohio, their faces a mixture of fear, relief, and restrained anger. Seeing Emily bruised and bandaged, yet resolute, was a shock they struggled to comprehend. "I just wanted to serve, Mom, Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her father's eyes welled with tears, his hands trembling as he adjusted the folds of her uniform. "And you did," he said softly. "You did more than that." Her mother clasped her hand, whispering, "We're proud of you, Emily, so proud." The presence of her parents, combined with the knowledge that the generals had intervened, brought a measure of calm, though the pain in her head was still sharp. Meanwhile, the generals continued their work across the base. Investigators documented every injury, interviewed every recruit, and began building a detailed picture of the abusive culture that had persisted. Emily's name had become central to the investigation, not because she sought attention, but because her courage had forced the system to act. Other recruits, inspired by her resilience, began coming forward. Stories that had been whispered in fear for months were now recounted openly. Forced physical labor, prolonged drills without water, verbal assaults, threats of punishment, and other forms of humiliation. Emily listened to fragments as they passed through the hospital, each new story reinforcing the magnitude of what had occurred. The sergeant, once a figure of unquestioned authority, had been removed from the field and placed under immediate suspension. Emily's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and cautious satisfaction. Months of silent endurance, of invisible suffering, had led to this point. Those who had wielded power through fear were now exposed, facing scrutiny they could not escape. Jackson, too, was isolated for questioning. His bravado had vanished, replaced by palpable anxiety. He no longer had an audience to intimidate. The cycle of fear that had empowered him was broken. Emily was allowed to rest briefly, but she remained acutely aware of the ongoing investigation. Soldiers were brought in, one by one, to recount their experiences. Emily could hear fragments as she rested. "We had to run through the mud for hours. The sergeant made us lift logs until our arms went numb. I saw her get kicked, and I wanted to say something, but I was too scared." The weight of their words pressed on Emily. She had been just one soldier, yet her courage had sparked a wave of testimony that would hold those responsible accountable. Throughout the day, Emily received treatment and evaluation from the base medical staff. They examined her head, monitoring for concussion symptoms, checked her bruises, and ensured she could move safely. Pain radiated through her skull and body, yet she maintained focus. Each checkup was a reminder of the violence she had endured, and each nurse's reassuring words offered a measure of relief. She understood that survival was more than physical endurance. It was also about mental resilience and the courage to demand accountability. By afternoon, the generals returned to provide an update on the reforms underway. Their presence was steadying and awe-inspiring. Immediate reforms are being implemented, one announced. Anonymous reporting systems will be established. Instructors and trainees responsible for abuse are under investigation. The unit is officially shut down until further notice. Emily felt a mix of relief and pride. The chain of command that had allowed cruelty to thrive was now under scrutiny, and she had been central to ensuring accountability. Her actions had created a ripple effect far beyond what she could have imagined. As news of the shutdown spread, whispers of relief swept through the ranks. Soldiers began cautiously speaking to each other, discussing the changes, sharing their own experiences. Emily overheard conversations filled with shock, sorrow, and cautious optimism. "I can't believe it's finally happening," one recruit whispered. "We might actually be safe now." The very culture that had forced silence for months was beginning to change, and Emily realized her ordeal had played a pivotal role. Fear had been replaced with the possibility of justice, and the presence of the generals had ensured it would not be ignored. Later that evening, Emily was allowed a private meeting with the generals. They spoke directly to her, acknowledging her courage and the impact of her testimony. "Private Carter," one said, "your willingness to speak the truth has ensured accountability and sparked reform. You have demonstrated courage beyond measure. Your actions will protect countless soldiers in the future." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of humility and pride. The validation was overwhelming. She had endured pain, humiliation, and fear, but her defiance had transformed into real-world change. Her voice mattered, and it had been heard. In the hours that followed, Emily's parents remained by her side, offering comfort and reassurance. They marveled at her resilience and the extraordinary chain of events that had unfolded. "You've changed things here, Emily," her mother said softly. "You've saved people, including yourself, in a way that's remarkable." Her father nodded in agreement, brushing a hand over her hair. Emily's chest swelled with gratitude, yet she remained acutely aware of the work ahead. The initial intervention was just the beginning. Lasting change would require ongoing vigilance and courage. Throughout the night, Emily reflected on the events that had led to this moment. She replayed the kick, the humiliation, the fear that had gripped her body, and the sudden arrival of the generals. Each memory was sharp, vivid, and painful, yet intertwined with the profound relief and satisfaction of witnessing accountability in action. She realized that courage was not only about enduring pain, but also about speaking truth, refusing silence, and demanding justice. Her survival had become a catalyst for systemic change, and that truth filled her with determination. By the time the sun rose again, Fort Benning had begun its transformation. Soldiers moved methodically through the base, reporting incidents, submitting to medical evaluation, and cooperating with investigators. The culture of fear that had dominated for months was being dismantled, brick by brick. Emily, still recovering, watched as the system responded in a way that had previously seemed unimaginable. Her ordeal had sparked action, and she recognized the extraordinary power of truth when paired with resilience. In the quiet moments before she finally drifted into sleep, Emily contemplated the journey she had endured. She had arrived at Fort Benning eager, determined, and proud, only to confront a culture of fear, abuse, and humiliation. She had been kicked in the head, humiliated, and nearly broken, but she had survived. And in surviving, she had catalyzed change, forcing accountability, inspiring courage, and ensuring that her fellow recruits would face a safer, fairer environment. The weight of her experiences was heavy, yet tempered by the knowledge that her defiance had mattered. As she lay back on the hospital bed, Emily allowed herself to rest, feeling exhaustion overtake her body. The pain from her head and body reminded her of the brutality she had endured. But the presence of the generals and the reforms now underway gave her hope. She realized that her actions had not only changed her life, but had also created a safer environment for others. Months of fear and silence had been replaced by courage, accountability, and a glimmer of justice that promised lasting reform. And as she closed her eyes, Emily understood something profound. True courage is rarely about grand gestures or acts of heroism in isolation. It is about endurance, defiance, and the willingness to speak when silence seems safer. It is about standing up, even when the world seems intent on pushing you down. Emily had been kicked, humiliated, and tested beyond her limits, but she had endured. And in that endurance, she had begun to reshape not just her own fate, but the culture of an entire training unit. Weeks passed after the dramatic shutdown of Emily Carter's training unit, yet the effects of that single day rippled through Fort Benning and beyond. Emily's body had begun to heal, but her mind was restless. The adrenaline, fear, and shock of the previous weeks had left an imprint she could not shake. Though her head still throbbed occasionally, and bruises darkened her skin, Emily found herself increasingly focused on the larger story, the accountability and reforms that were just beginning to unfold. She had survived, yes, but she also realized that the real work lay ahead, ensuring that no soldier would endure what she had. The investigation was comprehensive and thorough. Federal investigators, military lawyers, and senior officials swarmed the base, interviewing every recruit, senior trainee, and instructor. Emily, despite her lingering fatigue, was asked to provide testimony in multiple sessions. Each time she recounted the events, the kick, the harassment, the systematic abuse, her words carried weight. She described, in painstaking detail, the culture of fear that had pervaded the unit, the unreported incidents of abuse, and the way leaders had condoned cruelty under the guise of discipline. Her voice trembled at moments, but she refused to soften her words. Every sentence mattered. Emily became a linchpin in the investigation. Her testimony validated the experiences of other recruits who had long feared retaliation. The soldiers she had trained alongside, who had once whispered their fears in shadows, now spoke openly, inspired by her courage. Accounts poured in, days of relentless physical punishment, verbal abuse that cut to the bone, forced exhaustion, and even near injury for failing to meet impossible expectations. Investigators listened carefully, cross-referencing reports, matching medical records, and piecing together a mosaic of systemic failure that no one could ignore. Emily realized that her pain had become a catalyst for justice. Jackson, the trainee who had kicked her, faced repeated questioning. Emily's recollection of the incident was precise and unwavering. "He struck me in the head," she stated firmly in front of the investigators. The sergeant saw it and did nothing. This was deliberate, not accidental. Jackson's face was pale, and his attempts to deflect responsibility crumbled under scrutiny. The investigators pressed for clarity on every point, probing inconsistencies and ensuring accountability would not be evaded. Emily felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. For months, he had relied on fear to dominate, but now truth had turned the tables. The sergeant's hearings were more intense. Every action, every order, every missed intervention was scrutinized. Emily watched remotely as the officers and generals questioned him, detailing how his leadership had created an environment that enabled abuse. He attempted to justify his methods, citing tradition and discipline, but the generals' voices cut through with unwavering clarity. Discipline is never cruelty. Leadership is never fear. Emily felt the weight of justice in the room as the sergeant struggled to respond. For the first time, she understood that those who had relied on fear for control were powerless in the face of truth. As the days progressed, Emily's influence extended beyond recounting her own experience. Investigators asked her to review statements, verify incidents, and provide insight into the culture that had allowed abuse to flourish. She worked long hours, her mind alert despite physical fatigue, helping to identify patterns of mistreatment and the individuals responsible. The more she participated, the more she realized the depth of systemic failure. It was not just Jackson or the sergeant, but a chain of tacit approval and silence that had permitted cruelty to persist. Her voice became not only testimony, but guidance for reform. Emily's parents visited frequently, offering both support and perspective. Her mother, often quiet, said one afternoon, "Emily, your strength isn't just in surviving, it's in making sure this doesn't happen again." Her father added, "You've turned suffering into action. That's rare, and it matters." Emily took their words to heart. She realized that courage was contagious. Her survival had given others permission to speak, but her actions could also ensure structural changes that prevented future abuse. She felt a sense of responsibility she had never anticipated, yet embraced it. The investigation eventually expanded to cover the entire training protocol. External reviewers, military psychologists, and veteran advisors scrutinized the drills, punishments, and reporting systems. Emily contributed insight on what had broken trust between trainees and instructors. "We were afraid to speak," she explained. "Even when injuries occurred, we didn't report them because no one would listen. Discipline was a weapon, not a tool." The investigators nodded, taking notes. Every detail she offered helped shape policies that would prevent similar abuses in the future. Emily began to understand that her personal pain had become the foundation for systemic reform. Weeks of testimony and hearings culminated in a high-profile military review. Emily, along with several other recruits, was invited to present statements to senior officials and generals. Cameras were absent, but the weight of the room was palpable. She described the culture of fear, the lack of oversight, and the moments that had left indelible marks on her body and mind. Every word was deliberate, measured, and truthful. The generals, the investigators, and senior officers listened intently. Emily felt her voice resonate in the room. Months of fear, humiliation, and endurance had led to this moment. The system was finally listening. The final hearings addressed the individuals responsible. Jackson faced reprimand and mandatory retraining, while the sergeant faced suspension pending a full review. Instructors who had looked the other way were held accountable for neglecting duty. Emily sat quietly, watching as justice unfolded. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and lingering sadness for the months of unnecessary suffering endured by herself and others. But more than anything, she felt hope. For the first time, the system had responded decisively, signaling that abuse and fear would not be tolerated. Emily's impact extended beyond the hearings. Other recruits from different units began sharing stories of abuse, inspired by her courage and the thorough investigation she had participated in. Anonymous reporting systems were strengthened, oversight protocols rewritten, and leadership training revised. Emily realized her experience had become a blueprint for change. Her ordeal, once deeply isolating and humiliating, now had far-reaching consequences. She had endured not only for herself, but for the countless recruits who would follow her path. By the end of the month, Emily returned home to Ohio briefly, though she carried the weight of ongoing investigations in her mind. Her hometown greeted her as a quiet hero, friends and neighbors expressing admiration for the courage she had displayed. Though she did not seek recognition, she understood the power of her story. Months of pain, humiliation, and near defeat had resulted in tangible reform, systemic accountability, and a renewed sense of trust among recruits. She had survived, endured, and ultimately reshaped the flawed system. As she reflected on the journey, Emily realized that her courage had not only brought accountability, but also hope. The general's intervention, combined with her steadfastness, had broken a cycle of fear. She understood that true leadership was measured not by the ability to enforce fear, but by the capacity to enforce justice and protect those under your command. Emily had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and moral clarity, a beacon for others to follow. By the time she returned fully to Fort Benning weeks later, the unit's operations were under strict review, and reforms were in place. Leadership retraining had begun, and reporting protocols were strengthened. Recruits now felt empowered to speak out, knowing their voices mattered. Emily moved through the base with quiet determination, observing the changes and mentoring newer recruits. Her presence was no longer one of fear or victimhood, but of guidance and resilience. The pain of her experience remained, yet it had been transformed into purpose. In those moments, Emily reflected on a single truth: courage is rarely solitary. Her survival, defiance, and willingness to speak had sparked a ripple effect, influencing not only her unit, but also the broader military culture. She had endured cruelty, witnessed injustice, and yet emerged with a sense of responsibility and hope. She had been kicked, humiliated, and tested beyond her limits, but she had stood firm, and her actions were reshaping lives. The realization brought her a quiet satisfaction. Emily Carter's return to civilian life in Ohio was marked by a mixture of relief, reflection, and an undercurrent of unresolved tension. Though the immediate dangers at Fort Benning were behind her, the emotional imprint of the ordeal remained. She awoke each morning with the throb of a dull headache, a reminder of the kick that had started the chain of events. Yet alongside the pain, there was pride not only in surviving, but in sparking reforms that would protect countless soldiers in the future. She was no longer just a trainee. She had become a symbol of resilience and justice. Her family welcomed her with open arms, their expressions a combination of worry and admiration. Her father, still shaken by the memory of seeing her bruised and bandaged, hugged her tightly. "We always knew you were strong, Emily," he whispered. Her mother's tears were quieter, but no less intense. "You didn't just survive, you made a difference. People will remember this." Emily felt their warmth and support settle over her, a comforting anchor in the sea of memories that still threatened to overwhelm her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply and feel grounded in a world that wasn't defined by fear. But the quiet of her hometown was deceptive. Emily's story had begun to spread, first through the military channels, then through local news outlets, and eventually reaching national attention. Her courage had captured imaginations, particularly because it was rooted in truth, not self-promotion. Articles described the abuse at Fort Benning, the decisive arrival of the generals, and Emily's pivotal role in ensuring accountability. Emails from concerned citizens, veterans, and active duty soldiers began arriving almost daily, thanking her for speaking out, for catalyzing reform, and for demonstrating the power of moral courage. Emily read each one carefully, feeling a mix of humility and responsibility. Her time at home was also a period of reflection. She walked the streets she had known since childhood, noticing the familiar sights through a lens sharpened by recent events. Each small detail, the rusted playground swing, the corner store, the library steps, felt imbued with new meaning. She realized that courage, resilience, and justice were not confined to battlefields or military bases. They were relevant in every part of life. Standing in the quiet of her hometown, she understood that her actions had ripple effects far beyond her immediate experience. The principles she had fought for, truth, accountability, and protection for the vulnerable, were universal. Emily's friends, many of whom had known her since childhood, greeted her with awe and curiosity. They asked about Fort Benning, the investigation, the generals, and the reforms. Emily recounted events with care, balancing the raw truth with a narrative of hope and resilience. "It was terrifying," she admitted one afternoon, "but it also showed me that systems can change, that courage matters, and that one voice can make a difference." Her words resonated, particularly with younger acquaintances who faced their own challenges, both in school and life. She realized her story was no longer solely about personal survival. It had become a lesson, a blueprint for standing up against injustice in all forms. Soon, Emily was invited to speak at a series of local and regional events, addressing military personnel, veterans groups, and advocacy organizations. She approached these opportunities with a mixture of nerves and determination. Each time she recounted her experience, she emphasized not only the abuse she had endured, but the transformative power of intervention, accountability, and speaking out. Her speeches inspired listeners, many of whom had remained silent in their own lives for fear of retaliation or disbelief. Emily became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of empowered action, a living example that survival could catalyze change. During these events, Emily was also approached by military reform organizations and policymakers. They asked for her insights on reporting systems, leadership training, and methods to prevent abuse in military training programs. Emily shared her first-hand experience with clarity and compassion, detailing what had allowed the abusive culture to persist and how the general's intervention had shifted the balance. Her recommendations were taken seriously, with several committees incorporating her suggestions into new training protocols. Emily felt a profound sense of purpose. Her suffering had transformed into advocacy, her pain into progress, and her survival into a tool for systemic reform. While public attention brought validation, it also carried scrutiny. Some questioned the details, others debated the effectiveness of reforms, and a few criticized the focus on one individual's experience. Emily handled these challenges with grace, emphasizing the collective nature of the change. "This isn't about me alone," she told a regional news outlet. "It's about every recruit, every trainee, and every leader responsible for creating safe, just environments. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Her poise, honesty, and commitment to systemic change earned respect even from skeptics. Back in Ohio, Emily also reconnected with her community in quieter ways. She spent evenings walking along familiar streets, volunteering at local youth centers, and mentoring students interested in military service. She emphasized resilience, integrity, and moral courage, illustrating lessons drawn directly from her experiences. Her presence inspired others, particularly young women, to challenge fear and assert their voices. She realized that her influence extended beyond formal platforms. Every conversation, every mentorship, every shared experience reinforced the lessons of accountability and courage. Months after leaving Fort Benning, Emily received official recognition from military authorities. A formal citation acknowledged her bravery, her role in catalyzing reform, and her participation in investigations that had led to systemic change. While Emily did not seek accolades, the acknowledgement felt meaningful. It was proof that her suffering had not been ignored, that her courage had mattered, and that her actions had tangible, lasting impact. She framed the citation in her room at home, a reminder not of personal glory, but of responsibility, endurance, and the difference one voice could make. Emily also continued to receive letters and messages from fellow recruits and military personnel across the country. Many shared stories of similar experiences, inspired by her courage to speak out. Some asked for advice on navigating difficult situations. Others expressed gratitude for her role in prompting reform. Emily responded when she could, offering guidance, reassurance, and encouragement. She realized that her journey had created a network of resilience, connecting those who had endured abuse with a sense of solidarity, accountability, and hope. As the year drew to a close, Emily reflected on the arc of her journey. From the brutal kick on the training field to the arrival of the generals, the shutdown of the unit, the investigation, and now her role as an advocate, she had transformed pain into purpose. She had endured the worst of human cruelty and emerged not only alive but empowered, capable of effecting systemic change. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had endured, suffered, and survived in silence. Late one evening, Emily sat by her bedroom window, gazing at the quiet streets of her hometown. The moonlight reflected off the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the pavement. She thought of the soldiers she had helped protect, the reforms that had been enacted, and the courage she had discovered within herself. She realized that true bravery was not simply surviving brutality, but using survival as a platform for change. The kick that had once threatened to break her body had become the catalyst for transformation, both personal and systemic. Emily smiled faintly, her body still bearing the marks of her ordeal, but her spirit unbroken. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, yet she was ready to face them with the same courage, integrity, and resilience that had carried her through the darkest days at Fort Benning. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a beacon for justice, accountability, and hope, a living testament to the power of truth and moral courage. And in that quiet moment, Emily Carter knew that her journey was far from over, but she was ready to continue stronger than ever, committed to ensuring that no one else would endure what she had endured. By the time spring arrived in Ohio, Emily Carter had fully returned home, though the memories of Fort Benning remained vivid. The bruises on her body had faded, but the lessons endured. She moved through her daily life with a quiet strength, carrying the weight of her experiences, not as a burden, but as a tool for transformation. Her role as an advocate had expanded, drawing attention from military officials, veterans, policymakers, and young recruits seeking guidance. Emily had become a symbol of courage, resilience, and accountability, inspiring systemic change across training programs nationwide. The final stages of the military investigation were underway, and Emily continued to provide testimony and insights, albeit remotely. She assisted in reviewing revised training protocols, ensuring that safeguards against abuse were implemented. Anonymous reporting systems were strengthened, instructors were retrained, and oversight mechanisms were formalized. Each reform she contributed to represented a victory, not only for herself, but for the countless recruits who had suffered silently for months. Emily felt a profound sense of purpose. Her ordeal, once deeply isolating, had evolved into a platform for structural and cultural change. Emily also reconnected with the recruits who had stood alongside her, those whose lives had been most directly impacted by the unit's abuse. Together, they formed a network of support and advocacy. They exchanged messages, shared progress updates, and collaborated on recommendations for broader reform. Emily realized that survival had not been enough. Building resilience and ensuring that the lessons endured were equally critical. Her courage had sparked change, but collective action ensured that the reforms would last. She felt an immense sense of responsibility and pride, knowing that her voice had become a catalyst for communal empowerment. In addition to military recognition, Emily's story gained traction in educational and civic spaces. Schools invited her to speak about courage, accountability, and moral integrity. Students listened intently as she described the culture of fear at Fort Benning, the pivotal intervention by the generals, and the steps taken to dismantle systemic abuse. Her message was clear. Standing up for justice is never easy, but it is essential. Emily's personal narrative became a lesson in resilience and ethics, demonstrating that one person's actions can ripple outward to effect profound change. While her public presence grew, Emily remained grounded. She spent quiet evenings reflecting on her journey, balancing advocacy with personal recovery. She took long walks through the fields near her childhood home, appreciating the calm and stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos she had endured. The trauma of Fort Benning had left an indelible mark, yet Emily found strength in the knowledge that she had survived, spoken out, and contributed to meaningful reform. Each step she took through familiar landscapes felt symbolic in assertion that she had moved from victimhood to agency, from fear to empowerment. The military reforms she helped implement began to yield results. Reports of abuse decreased across training units as instructors adjusted to stricter oversight, accountability mechanisms, and a culture that prioritized safety alongside discipline. The stories Emily had helped bring to light prevented countless instances of harm, transforming fear into vigilance and silence into voice. Her advocacy had proven that a single act of courage could alter systems, and that accountability, when enforced decisively, could shift power away from those who abused it. One afternoon, Emily received a letter from one of the generals who had first intervened at Fort Benning. It read, in part, "Private Carter, your courage set in motion reforms that will protect countless soldiers for generations. You have not only survived, you have transformed the culture of training. Your legacy will endure." Emily held the letter in her hands, feeling a mixture of humility, pride, and resolve. She understood that the general's intervention had been pivotal, but her persistence, testimony, and integrity had ensured that change was permanent. It was the culmination of months of struggle, endurance, and moral courage. The personal impact of her journey was also profound. Emily had grown stronger, more self-assured, and more attuned to the importance of integrity in leadership. She realized that courage was not merely the absence of fear, but the capacity to act in its presence. Every lecture, every interview, every interaction with recruits or policymakers reinforced her understanding that her survival was inseparable from her responsibility to create positive change. Emily's growth extended beyond herself, influencing the military culture, her community, and the lives of those who had endured abuse silently. Emily's parents watched her transformation with awe. Her father, once worried and protective, marveled at her resilience. "You've turned hardship into purpose," he said one evening. Her mother nodded, eyes glistening with tears. "Not everyone can do what you did. You didn't just survive, you inspired a movement, Emily." Their words were a grounding force, reminding her that her courage had personal and communal impact. She understood that the legacy of her actions was not only institutional, but deeply human, touching families, friends, and future generations of recruits. As months turned into a year, Emily continued to mentor young recruits and advise military reform committees. Her presence at Fort Benning became symbolic of accountability and resilience, even though she no longer trained there. Her story served as a reminder that bravery is not always found in confrontation alone. It is found in endurance, in speaking truth to power, and in turning personal suffering into systemic reform. Emily's voice, once silenced by fear, now resonated widely, shaping policy, inspiring courage, and creating safer environments for all. One spring morning, Emily walked across a field near her home, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the kick to her head, the humiliation, and the fear that had dominated her months at Fort Benning. And she remembered the arrival of the generals, whose intervention had saved her from further harm. Every step she took was symbolic. She had been brought low, but she had risen, resilient and empowered. She realized that courage was not only surviving cruelty, it was transforming it, turning suffering into change that outlives oneself. In her heart, Emily knew the journey was ongoing. The reforms she helped initiate required vigilance, mentorship, and persistent advocacy. Yet she embraced the challenge, understanding that her experiences had equipped her uniquely for this work. Emily had been tested in ways few could imagine, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and committed to justice. The legacy of her ordeal extended far beyond herself, impacting military culture, inspiring others, and demonstrating that moral courage can catalyze profound transformation. Emily's final reflection, as she stood in the quiet of the Ohio fields, was one of profound clarity. The abuse she endured, the kick that nearly broke her, and the months of fear had all been transformed into purpose, influence, and systemic change. She had been tested, pushed to her limits, and nearly defeated, but she had endured, spoken, and acted. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an agent of justice, a symbol of courage, and a beacon for those who had suffered in silence. And as the sun rose over her hometown, casting golden light across the familiar streets and fields, Emily Carter smiled, knowing that her journey had meaning far greater than her own survival. She had endured cruelty, transformed pain into purpose, and sparked change that would endure long into the future. Her legacy was clear. Courage, truth, and moral integrity could conquer fear and reshape systems. She had been kicked, tested, and humiliated, but she had risen, and in rising, she had inspired a movement.